There are a lot of really strange stories in Scripture, are there not? And some of them are challenging to make sense of at times. And indeed, if we read St. Paul's theology, often it really tests our conceptual capacity. He's thinking in ways that we're not comfortable with or used to, I suppose. But by contrast, James is a really straight shooter. His emphasis is on practical response to God. It sounds almost basic when you read it at times, yet I reckon it's a really important reminder of some bedrock truths that we do well to look at one more time. He starts off by saying, and you might think that you don't need to be told this, but if you're suffering, pray. The word prayer actually is derived from the same root as our word precarious. Prayer is the cry of the precarious. It's an almost involuntary cry of the heart. When we're holding on by a thread, our hearts pray. I say almost involuntary because we can train ourselves not to cry out. Now, in a sense, some parents who manage bedtime with their babies teach this in a controlled crying approach. You might be familiar with this. Rather than respond to their baby's cry immediately, they leave a longer and longer pause to teach the infant to soothe themselves and get themselves to sleep. And self-soothing and falling asleep are two very helpful skills to have as you go through life. So that's really good. But sometimes a slightly less helpful message slips in as well. The message that there is no point crying out. No one will come. No one cares. Sometimes it's that we've cried out to God, but the response from the heavens has not been what we had hoped for. And somewhere deep within, we conclude that God either isn't interested, doesn't care, or is not powerful to achieve the outcome we're interested in, or maybe God isn't really there at all. So it's good to be reminded, I reckon, if you're suffering, pray. God does hear. God does care. God is powerful to respond. However, God's response may be different to that which you were expecting. God's power is far more powerful than we ever imagine, I think. God wants to do transforming work in the hardest place of all for a miracle to be wrought, and that is in our hearts. I reckon it's far easier for us to imagine that God's intervention will be out there somewhere, in the world around us, the world of our circumstances. When we ask God to make something different, it's natural for us to assume that we ourselves are fixed in that equation. We are unchanging and unchangeable. But as I reflect on nearly 40 years of my Christian discipleship, quite honestly, the greatest miracles in number and in impact on me and others, and the most remarkably unexpected ones too, so in that sense, the most miraculous miracles, have been changes in my own heart. When you cry out to God, expect a miracle, but be aware, odds on, it will be manifest in the changing of your own heart. James goes on, if you're rejoicing, sing praises. And again, this might seem equally obvious. Why do we need to be told to sing praises if we're rejoicing? But strangely, again, it's not so obvious, because too often we carry the assumption that things should simply work out for us. When they do, we don't rejoice. We just kind of go, oh, well, my expectations were met. That's what I was expecting. Everything worked out. It should. It did. Well done, everything. Did you hear about the earthquake that happened in southeastern Australia this week on Wednesday? There was a bit of a shake around 9 o'clock in the morning. Damage, fortunately, was very minor, and I don't believe anybody got seriously injured. But it shook a very large area, and many people became quite unnerved by it because we're not used to earthquakes, even though it was one of a great number of earthquakes that happened across the globe this week. And also there's some unusually intense volcanic activity happening in the Canary Islands at the moment, taking people their interest over there. It's a bit distressing because homes and villages are being swallowed up by this kind of slow motion lava flow that's pouring down the sides of this volcano, where they didn't expect it to happen, obviously, because they built houses there. And it is just one of nearly 30 currently erupting volcanoes around the world, and there's many again considered active and smoking and so forth. And as I listened to the reporting about these events, I heard one person express their realization that the earth is not as static or stable as they had always assumed. You know, when the ground moves, you kind of go, hang on, that's not supposed to move. And another fellow who was losing his livelihood and his home at the Canary Island eruption thing was angry at the authorities for not giving people more notice. Like, he thought they could have known this was going to happen and given us, 6 months notice so we could have relocated and not lost all our belongings. Maybe that's fair, I'm not sure. The interesting thing was I didn't hear anybody express gratitude. I didn't hear anybody say, wow, things have been relatively stable in most places most of the time. Isn't that amazing? No, despite all evidence to the contrary, we expect the earth to be stable and static. When things are going well, we don't rejoice. Did you rejoice today that there was no earthquake or no volcano? We miss the opportunity to sing praises to God because we've made ourselves so central to our world that things working out is merely our baseline expectation. And we miss out on rejoicing and giving thanks. And along with our diminished capacity for gratitude, there's another poverty of this baseline expectation of things working out for us, and that is our sense of being alone when they don't work out for us. When life takes a disastrous turn, some can be lured into believing that it's all their own doing and that they are thereby condemned. And to be fair, we often have a hand in our own demise, don't we? We all do silly things from time to time, but even then it's unlikely it's all our own fault. And whether it be all our own fault or not, we can still get help and support. We can call the elders to pray. Why the elders? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. James talks about the notion of confession and prayer for healing. And it's worth remembering that the notion of healing and the notion of salvation are very much aligned in the mind of a person when James was writing this originally. After all, being saved from illness or being saved from death or being saved from damnation is kind of much the same gesture. It's just different realms and varying intensities, really. When James recommends calling the elders and that confession and prayer is the path to healing, I don't think he is making a distinction between what we might call salvation and what we might call recovery from illness. Both can be attended to by the elders. And bear in mind, in those days when James was writing, there were no antibiotics. And there was no thoroughgoing understanding of the body's many systems. There was some medical knowledge, but it was pretty rudimentary at best and a little bit dangerous at worst. Yet, while the connection between mind and the rest of the body was not well understood at that time, the practice of solidarity and praying for a person, solidarity with and praying for a person, has always had an impact on the way a body functions. Just as cursing and abandonment can have the opposite impact. You may have heard of pointing the bone in Indigenous communities in Australia in the ancient days. If you exclude and condemn someone, it has a really negative impact. If you stand with and pray for someone, it can revive them, bring life to them. We are never more human as when we are part of a community. Our meaningful connections have a profound impact on our sense of everything, and indeed even our capacities and our desires for life and navigating life. And I think Janet would testify to this too. She wisely accessed all that medical professionals could offer her when she had that issue, which still hasn't been completely understood by the medical professionals. They've done incredible work, and Janet agrees that this is an expression of God's gracious provision. But she would also tell you, vital to her recovery has been the prayer, love, and support of her community, who stood with her and did practical things, but prayed and watched and just paid attention to her. These sorts of things achieve something that medical interventions simply cannot attend to, and they're very important. See, people create a social environment. We notice this, our sheer enjoyment of being with some people, or perhaps our fear and apprehension when we are with other people. Even if we're doing exactly the same activities with those two different groups of people, our experience can be very different. I think we encounter this a little bit when we go to different churches sometimes. If you've done that, you can have a very different experience of church depending on the people that are there. And even though you might have exactly the same liturgy or setup, and it's all theoretically Christian worship, in some environments we experience coolness, awkwardness, uncertainty about what's acceptable here, a sense maybe of fragility. If we stray outside accepted norms, the whole enterprise becomes threatened and everyone holds their bum cheeks in and takes a deep breath. In other churches, we experience welcome, acceptance, respect, a challenge to us that profoundly addresses us but empowers us to make a change for good. And the difference, in my view, is righteous people. Righteous people help create a life-giving social environment. How? They look out for one another. They form genuine bonds of commitment and care. They understand and respect the impact we can have on one another. They know and appreciate the life-giving benefits of healthy community. And this may not sound like remarkable wisdom, yet in our culture, where we have so elevated autonomous individualism, not only is it becoming less well appreciated what community does, there are also fewer people with the skills and commitment to do the vital work of building community. And I have to say, here at Mustard Seed, we are incredibly blessed because we have more than our fair share, and we are very fortunate for that. Now, the thing about righteous people, of course, is they are not perfect people. They are not God in the flesh type people. Righteous people are broken people like everybody, broken, forgiven people, people who are on a journey toward being perfected, which means they are people keenly aware of the distance yet to be covered. Righteous people are entirely confident in the God who has committed to the task of doing that work of righteousness in us and with us and through us. Righteous people have an effect of dissolving barriers we naturally set up. They do so not as a deliberate strategy, interestingly, but by their constant awareness that they are just like everybody else. Not trying to be just like everybody else, but the profound awareness that we actually are just like everybody else. Whenever we seek to other somebody, we believe we are not like them. And the best way to dissolve that is to realize that we are. I'll never forget the first time that out-of-control rage that I've spoken about every now and then here. It's not a common thing for me. I'm not a wildly angry person, but when the kids were small, every now and then it did well up. And one time when I was the only parent at home, and I was at home with the girls, and it frightened me how easily I could have done real damage to my precious daughters when I was under such unbearable pressure and I kind of started to crack. Never again will I be able to look at someone who has shaken an infant into severe injury and see a monster. Rather, I see myself only with fewer supports. See, the righteous know a deeper truth. Below the superficial markers we might designate to separate out them from us is a far more significant pool of realities that hold us all in common. We all stray from the good path from time to time. It's an experience common to every person who's not had a period of lapse in their years of discipleship, or maybe you're only young in your discipleship and that's ahead of you. And I don't mean chucking it all in necessarily, but losing touch with what following Christ is really all about. Left to our own devices, we either stray from necessary discipline, or we can even make our discipline into something of a new law for ourselves. And both forms of stumbling can be equally unhelpful. So to rescue a person from these kinds of errors is an incredible gift to them. A life lost in wanton excesses quickly loses meaning and leaves a person bereft of purpose, and nothing can fill that void. Equally, a life locked up in strict compliance to once self-regulated disciplines that have become external masters, so that we are entrapped by our own rules. That's no life at all either. To help someone find salvation, the grace of Christ is to offer something beyond price. Grace reminds us that we are loved and held by one who is bigger than us. The held part of that reminds us that there's something bigger for us to live into. The kingdom is not anything goes, it is a way to live, and that makes life more alive for us. And the loved part reminds us that we are held in grace. We do not need to jump through hoops to earn God's love. We are loved. We have always been loved, and we shall always be loved. And to help a person remember and return to faith is good for that person, absolutely, for sure. But not simply for that person alone, but also for the community. To help someone turn from being lost and a self-absorbed consumer, for example, and help them find relationship that's not only offers life to them, but causes them to become a person who offers life to others, that's a major good for the whole community. To help a person find release from arbitrary strictures that they have become entangled in, so that they discover new freedoms to care for themselves healthily, and not just themselves, but others around them, this is great for the community. Years ago, there used to be this thing called compound interest. Some of you will remember it. Back in the days when banks offered interest on saving accounts, it went a bit like this. You put money in the bank, you earned a return on that money that you'd invested, and then the return adds to the amount of money that you have in the bank, and therefore your amount invested is even greater, and you get a return on your original amount and the return that was added to it. And so it kind of snowballs, it grows exponentially. That's how the kingdom grows. As we each help one another discover the fullness of the grace of Christ, we change in life-giving ways, and that changes all of us into more life-giving ways. The net result is that there's a lot more life for everyone, to be enjoyed by everyone, which in itself generates a greater abundance of life for everyone. It's an abundance culture. So good old James, he's interested in our practical response to God. Remember, if you're suffering, cry out. If you are rejoicing, sing praises. If you're struggling, ask for help. Those who are mature in their discipleship can help. And it is never too late to make the future better by taking action now.